Hello and welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. I wanted to do just a very brief episode to kind of lay out a little bit the significance of one of the clips that I recently uploaded to the YouTube channel, because I think it's really fascinating to see how the church and the people that they're bringing out to defend its various doctrines and teachings, how they're taking some of the wider philosophical ways that we're starting to look at the world and trying to incorporate them into how they defend the church. And in some cases, at the same time that they're trying to defend past policies, they inadvertently shoot themselves in the foot and kind of disprove their own position. And I think this is kind of a really good example of that. So if you go to the Thoughts on Things and Stuff YouTube channel, you'll see a recent clip that I'm going to go ahead and bring up here. It's called the 2021 Fair Conference, Agency and the Importance of Truth. And it's taken from a talk titled Agentic Sexuality, how Latter-day Saint perspective can rescue humanity from the tyranny of the abstract. And the original author of the paper is actually not the one giving the presentation. He had COVID, and so it was a co-author of the paper that is reading it out. So the person who's reading this actually was part of creating it. And what they're doing, if you go and read the whole paper, it's actually really fascinating, because what they're saying is they're saying, okay, well, there's this postmodern way of looking at things where we kind of deconstruct the words that we use to describe the world around us, ask ourselves, what does it really mean to be this or that? And then bounce those ideas after, against the concepts of, how do we know what truth is? The things that we take for granted in the world around us, should we really take them for granted? And it's a little bit disturbing, because the gist of the entire paper is these ideas that we have about homosexuality are identities that are based on abstract concepts that you can't really point to any objective thing in the world, in the real world, and say, well, that there is the homosexuality gene or homosexuality something. These exist as ideas that humans categorize themselves into. And since they are abstract ideas, then you don't really want to categorize yourself as one of these ideas. The actions that you do, such as if you play golf, then you're a golfer, and he uses that metaphor. Those are the things that then attract these labels, and you can opt into or opt out of those labels just by using your own agency. And so he centers this concept of agency against the backdrop of these identities that people have that are based on abstract concepts. And then he goes a step further and he says, since these things are just abstract concepts, they're not categorical descriptors of real world things, then you can change them. And it should be no surprise, if you follow that thread of logic, that leads you into a justification of exactly what was going on in the 1970s that's hit the news recently, where Dallin H. Oaks said that homosexual conversion therapy, where they use electric shocks or inducing nausea and vomiting when exposed to homosexual imagery to try to change somebody's mindset regarding sexual attraction, it justifies that, because it says, well, these actions then are simply things that you give yourself over to. They're not actually anything inherent or essential about you. And so you can change it by doing these various things to change the action, and then that takes you out of being homosexual. It's surprising to hear them go down this line. And there's actually a great deal of truth to how they lay out the fact that there are certain abstractions that people tend to categorize themselves into. But there's a point at which the experience of people who have tried to employ that particular philosophical perspective and found themselves hurt and damaged by the trauma induced as a result of that leads you to say there's something disconnected there. But for me, that was interesting, and I think that needs to be explored more, because this paper is going to be presented in a psychology journal. At least that's what they say. And so it's really, and he's from, I think, the Department of Psychology or a mental health department in BYU. So it's interesting that this perspective is sent there. Now, that idea that certain things that have been used as labels to categorize people kind of locks you into something is something that mental health professionals are very interested in, because patterns of behavior that somebody takes as essential, inherent to them, but they actually have more agency to choose or not choose, just in other parts of your life, not dealing with the homosexuality issue. That's actually very empowering, because there are aberrant thought processes that do lock people into things that once they realize they have some power and control over how they deal with the world, they can start to take more proactive action and strengthen those aspects of their life that help them to control these things. So cognitive behavioral therapy is an evidence-based practice that mental health professionals use to help people get out of some of those calcified ways of thinking about themselves. But that doesn't mean that you can apply it to the entire world in the same way. Now, that aside, near the end of his presentation, right before he kind of cuts himself off, he makes an argument about the importance of basing your conception of yourself and the world around you on actual objective truth. And he's making this argument because what he's trying to say is that these notions that somebody is an homosexual are actually not really objectively true. There's not a category of homosexuality. This is his argument for the whole paper. Therefore, someone can opt in or out of it. But he ends up making an argument that is one of the most eloquent explanations for why people who leave the church find it so important to focus on whether or not the truth claims of the church and its early founders are legitimate, because it makes the difference between whether you are an actual person exercising free agency, not radical free agency, but free agency in the context of our world, relying on things that you believe to be true, or whether you are a subject to a false delusion. And he uses some metaphor in this, but I want to kind of take it a little bit at a time to explore what exactly is going on. So let's go ahead and take a listen to his presentation. And he uses a lot of like gobbledygook language, but that's because he's actually approaching this question that a lot of turmoil has been put in by applying postmodernism to these questions. And he's actually using concepts from the academic discourse of postmodernism to try to deconstruct the things that postmodernism has constructed around this stuff. So like, if you can avoid having to go into this stuff, then you're lucky. Unfortunately, since it's starting to be more a part of church apologetics and the wider discussion that we're seeing about all sorts of issues, I've had to try to dive into it a little bit. You may have noticed on the channel. So let's take a listen here. I'm going to bring this up a little bit more, and I'll pause it and we'll do some commentary on what we see. Okay.
It is important to note here that the belief in invisible, magical, powerful abstractions is one of the sources of influence that are traditionally held to impact individual free choices or attempts to choose freely. If, however, the powerful abstractions developed in this discourse of our culture really do not exist or have any real causal power in themselves, then their influence can lie only in our giving them credence and allowing them to become the grounds for our free will choices.
Okay, so I want to pause right there and just point out, he is framing the concept of homosexuality as an essential category of what a person is as one of these magical abstractions that don't really accurately describe the real world. That's the gist of his presentation. Forgive me for Yu-Gi-Oh! And so his argument there is trying to frame it as that. Now, the problem is that the rest of the world is going to say, well, wait a second, magical abstractions that you assume to be real but actually aren't real is kind of a pretty good description for how people conceptualize the Mormon church and the doctrine and theology and claims of Joseph Smith, especially using the word magical, where there's seer stones and some Yu-Gi-Oh! He's the worst co-host ever. Anyway, where there's like seer stones and different things like that. Can we get that curtain closed? I'm sure that was like the Amazon delivery dude or something. Anyway, so these magical abstractions that he's referring to is something categorically different than what people will understand at the end of this discussion, but it's actually really important because what he's saying essentially, if we take what he's trying to apply this to out of that context and say, he's saying, we think that we have free agency, but if the pillars of truth describing the world around us that we're relying on are actually magical fairy tales and not real descriptions of the real world, then we are actually ourselves victims of a delusion and not free agents. And that's kind of what he's building up to.
But a choice made by an agent who gives credence to something that is not true or is not the case is in fact not really free in the way freedom is usually understood. For example, if Smith, as an adult, chose always to sleep on the couch in his home because he believed sincerely that there was a monster under the full-size bed in his house, and the monster was too large to fit under the couch, therefore the couch was a safer place to sleep. Would we be inclined to grant that Smith's choice is really a free choice, even though he made the free choice of his own free will? Would we not?
So that example right there is a kind of a brilliant exposition of the case that a lot of ex-Mormons have, which is that, he's using the parable. This guy named Smith believed that there was invisible monsters in his house, but they couldn't fit under the couch. And so he chose to sleep on the couch in order to escape the consequence of the monsters. Well, people who leave the church say, well, wait a second. We believed that Satan would have power over my spirit if I chose to disobey the leaders of the church. And so I shaped my life in a particular way according to what the leaders of the church told me, because I believed that the statements of the leaders of the church were true and that the authority that the leaders of the church had was real. And so I did these things, and it seems like I did them out of my own free will. Now, a lot of people will criticize people who leave the church and then say that their life was, robbed from them. Their agency was robbed from them because of the church. And they'll say, well, that's ridiculous. You understood, you freely made choices while you were a member of the church. You can't shape yourself as a victim of the church. And what he's saying is, if this Smith guy is, sleeping on the couch and making all these choices based on the idea of a monster, and that idea is not real, then he wasn't actually using free agency. He himself was more of a subject to these false narratives, this false delusion. And to the extent that some external person imposed that false narrative on him, then you could understand that he could look with some degree of responsibility on the person that gave him that false narrative and frame it as him having his life significantly affected by the actions of this other person who imposed the false narrative on him. And so that's kind of where a lot of people who leave the church find themselves. So let's keep going here.
In such a case, be more inclined to consider that Smith is not really exercising his agency because he is living in a false world, bestowing power in the form of influence on a false narrative, that is, on an entity that does not in fact exist in Smith's own narrative. Similarly, cultural narratives can obviate freedom and negate human agency on at least two levels. First,
okay, before he gets into this next section, he uses some excellent descriptors on what is actually going on here. He's saying that false narratives can obviate freedom. So you may think that you're acting freely, but because your choices are based on false ideas that are presented to you as real, then you're not actually acting freely. You're acting in a constrained, manipulated environment in which the forces or the entity or the situation that gave you that false narrative is constraining your choices or your sense of what agency you have. And it can negate human
agency on at least.
It negates human agency because the choices that you make are not choices that you would otherwise make if you had been in possession of a description of reality that was not based on this false narrative. And so this is a really good way for people to understand why, when you leave the church and you realize that the claims of Joseph Smith to have divine sanction for the doctrines that he brought out are illegitimate, and therefore all of the guidance for how people have to conform their lives to the margin, to the boundaries that the church leaders impose is illegitimate. And so that their whole identity that is so enmeshed with the church is an identity that has been manipulated from this external false narrative. Now, again, I think people in the church may listen to a statement like that and say, well, that means that you're just going to go out and do everything that, everything that the church leaders say not to do in order to express your individuality. You just want to sin. Just because you see that a false narrative has constrained your choices does not mean that you're going to immediately go out and murder, rape, and kill. It just means that certain aspects of your life that you would have taken different options or different choices on, but didn't because of the false narrative, you have to reconsider. All right. So let's keep going here.
At least two levels. First, by creating powerful narratives about ourselves and our world in which invisible, powerful abstractions exist and control many aspects of our lives, including the choices we make based on reasons that reflect our belief in the reality of those forces, and thus our own impotence in the face of such forces working in our lives. The second level on which freedom can be negated has to do with whether the various reasons for which we might make our free choices actually reflect truth. That is, the world as it really is, including the truth of our own being in the world. The common view of agency as described above as exercising one's freedom to choose in a situation despite influence to the contrary does not constitute human agency as we really live it out.
Okay, so before we get to that section of it, he brings up two different ways in which agency can be manipulated, and it may seem like you're acting as a free agent, but you're actually not. And the first thing is he describes powerful narratives about ourselves and the world we live in which invisible, powerful abstractions exist and control many aspects of our lives. Now, step out of the Mormon mindset and step into, for example, Scientology. In Scientology, there is this powerful narrative about each of us being inhabited by thetans, which increase the negative interactions that we have in our world, distract us from being our true selves. And the way that we can actually come to be our true authentic self is by doing the things that L. Ron Hubbard prescribed in terms of going clear. If you want to watch that documentary, you'll see all the details behind this. And that narrative shapes how Scientologists see themselves, how they see what they're supposed to do in their life, and ultimately how they reconcile themselves to being good people who are acting in accordance with this powerful narrative. But since, as outsiders, we see that that narrative is essentially just the product of a brilliant science fiction author who was so malicious as to constrain people who followed him by portraying his science fiction fantasies as real life, and that has continued beyond his death, we see that that's just a delusion, that people are not actually being given the freedom to act authentically because the world around them is not authentic. It's based on this false narrative. Now go to the Jehovah's Witnesses. They have the same thing. They see themselves as children of Jehovah who, in order for them to see themselves right with Jehovah, they have to follow the guidance and the leadership of the governing body of the Jehovah's Witnesses. And it's leading to an apocalyptic end where everybody else in the world is going to be destroyed. But those people who are faithful in obeying the governing body will be saved and be able to enter into a paradise. And so that narrative, that magical narrative, shapes all the actions that they do because they have, as outsiders, we see that this is a false narrative built on the ego of the men who have held power now and in the past in the church. Now, again, they project this false narrative onto the worldview of their believers, and then the believers think that they're acting of their own free will. They pursue being good in the world around them based on the narrative that they're given. But then that alters their free agency because they're not actually acting in the world how they would act if they realized that they had more choices. So if a Jehovah's Witness, and this example comes up a lot, but it's because it points directly to the problem. If they have a child who's in a car accident that needs a blood transfusion, because of that magical false narrative, they choose not to give the child blood fusion because Jehovah says that that's wrong and bad, and the current leaders endorse that view. And so in order for them to be good with Jehovah, they have to let their child die. And you can see how that act, they will say, this is my free choice, this is my freedom of religion. But what they actually are subject to is a false magical narrative that steals from them the choice that they would have to save their child. And so it interferes with their agency. Now, we've looked at Scientology and Jehovah's Witnesses, and you could just say anybody in either of those groups would also look at Mormonism, and they'd say, well, wait a second, they also have a magical worldview. They think that they are gods in embryo who can become like God in the future if they obey the brethren, obey and read the scriptures, do the right things, repent, continue. And Mormons in that paradigm will see themselves as acting as free agents. They're making their own choices, but their choices are limited by the commandments and instructions of the leader. The leaders and the scriptures, which are the result of past leaders, define how it is a person can act and still be good with God. And then that informs how these agents in the church, each individual in the church, then makes choices shaping their lives. And it's as simple as, because that narrative is you have to bring, for example, righteous spirits into the world, into a righteous Mormon household, well, then the pressure to get married early and to have a lot of children happens. And having a lot of children, prioritizing paying tithing over other things, changes how in your young adult life you shape yourself and you build your family. And there's risks that go along with that in terms of divorce rates and things like that. It's not a choice without consequence. And so this is where what some people would say are magical narratives that reach deep into your life and your identity have the effect of changing who you are. And to the extent that the narrative is not true, which is his second point, if these things that we're acting on are not actually true, they don't actually reflect the real world, then your agency is being taken from you. So the teachings of the Scientologists aren't actually true, and so their agency is being stolen from them, and it has consequences for their life and for their families. In Jehovah's Witnesses, because the things they're acting on aren't true, objectively or realistically true, then their agency is being stolen from them. And for ex-Mormons, people who have left the church, who now see the claims of Joseph Smith, his authority, and all the subsequent leaders after him as not actually being objectively true, then to the extent that they shaped their life and their identity around those magical narratives, their agency was taken from them. That's the point that this gentleman is inadvertently making. Okay, so let's go back and see what he finishes this out with. Powerful narratives. Okay. We'll just start here.
Exist and control many aspects of our lives, including the choices we make based on reasons that reflect our belief in the reality of those forces.
Okay, so the point that he makes there is that all of this is based on our belief that these narratives are true. And this is the real change that happens in the mind and life of somebody who leaves the church. It's because when you're in the faithful mindset, you believe that Joseph's claims about what you have to do in this life in order to secure an eternal family and potential godhood in the next life, you believe those claims are true, and so you act as if those claims are true. When you leave the church, you realize those claims aren't true. You come to that conclusion, and then you start to act without being constrained to the things that Joseph Smith and his subsequent leaders said were required in order for you to get that. So if you do decide to drink beer or have a coffee or tea, you're not making a choice to disobey and therefore forfeit your eternal existence. You're just realizing that that shaping of reality was not actually real. And so you don't even have to consider that in your choices. Now, that's not to say that you're going to go out and commit egregious moral sin like theft, robbery, rape, murder, all those other things, because there are other moral frameworks that give you plenty of reason not to do those things. And each of us still has a conscience that is equipped with empathy that has moral implications in how we behave in the world. Certainly there are exceptions, but it's wrong to just say that people who leave the church simply want to sin or they want to avoid the guilt. There's no guilt in something that you realize you should not have guilt over. So I don't feel guilt when I drink coffee. All right, so let's keep going.
and thus our own impotence in the face of such forces working in our lives. The second level on which freedom can be negated has to do with whether the various reasons for which we might make our free choices actually reflect truth. That is, the world as it really is, including the truth of our own being in the world. The common view of agency as described above, as exercising one's freedom to choose in a situation despite influence to the contrary, does not constitute human agency as we really live it out in almost all the situations in which we find ourselves in the course of daily life. The common view tends to emphasize particular specifiable choice points and the exercise of agency in a particular situation by weighing alternatives and deliberating on possible choices, while resisting some influences and opting in the direction of other possible influences. The problem is that in actually living our lives, we almost never do anything like this. A moment's reflection should be enough to convince us that there really are very few instances in any given day where we really go through that sort of detached, deliberative process of making a free choice that the common view assumes. For the most part, we go about living. We're just too busy doing what we want to do and what needs to be done. Of course, we might assume that true agency is brought out only on special occasions, but this line of thinking misses the ubiquity and the essence of our genuine agency. Our real human agency is not something we employ just on special, sometimes momentous occasions of careful calculative deliberation. Rather, human agency is the substance of our being in the world. It is the very stuff of which human life is composed. And as such, our agency cannot be disentangled from our very living and acting as the sort of beings we are.
Okay, so he's trying to draw the distinction here between these big momentous decisions that a false narrative informs how we shape our identity and our life, and then just us going about our day-to-day lives. And I think he's doing this to try to diminish the high importance of basing our decisions on these objective reality things. And he's trying to say we're just going to live our lives every day. But what I want you to kind of step back and say is this is akin to saying, you've got a rat in a maze. And the maze has all different twists and turns, but there are hard walls around certain parts of that maze. And you might look at it and say, well, if you take that rat out of that maze, well, he's going to be in the real world. And the real world has twists and turns just like the maze. And so really, he's just making choices about left or right or where to go. And it's just a maze. And, that's how it is. The problem is that there's those boundaries, those real world boundaries, and there's the shape of the maze itself. And to the extent that the rat doesn't get to choose to go outside of those boundaries, and if those boundaries are those momentous big occasions, then those are the ones that matter. And sure, as a Mormon, you may grow up and you make decisions that are, what to have for dinner, whether or not you go to scout camp, and they may be minor decisions that don't really have a huge effect on your life. But then you get to those major endpoints. Should I go to college or should I go on a mission? Should I marry someone after meeting them and only knowing them for 6 months because it's my religious duty to get married and start having children? Or should I to be more thoughtful and careful in the relationships that I choose? Should I pursue as a woman, should I pursue a career or should I be a homemaker? And all of these choices are things that people can make outside of the church too, but there's a right way to make these decisions in the church, and they constitute the hard walls of that maze. And just because those momentous occasions only happen at rare times or at significant times does not diminish their import. And the key thing here is that the inputs to those decisions, if they are informed by false magical narratives, as he puts it here, trying to describe other things other than the church, but the church fits into that category. If those decisions are informed by those inputs, then the result of those decisions are not the result of somebody actually acting of their free agency or of their agency in and of itself. It's a sort of false dilemma that they've put into, that they make a decision based on the information provided to them, but it's not objectively real. That being said, when you live in a high demand religion, I don't think he understands that, yes, all your decisions. I mean, we have this brilliant quote from David Ed Bednar that somebody sent me a recording of that I snipped it, and you can find it here. But he says, when you're a member of this church, the doctrine of the church, the teachings and instructions of the church should inform your decision every day, where you go, what you wear, who you associate with, who you don't associate with, the books you read, the movies you read, all of these different things, he claims, have to be influenced by your membership in the church and the doctrine and the teachings of the church. All of those things are the very small decisions that people make every day. And so they do actually affect who you are, the way that you see the world, because it's the air that you breathe as you go through life. And I don't think that he may be understanding the significance of that as he describes this in a way that's going towards, his ultimate goal, which is to diminish the sense that homosexuality is an identity and posit it more as a choice. Okay, so let's keep going.
To understand how this experience and exercise of agency, we have to focus not on deliberations and choice making, but on the hundreds or even thousands of things, ideas, feelings, and beliefs, aspirations, worries, traditions, relationships, purposes, and context of embodiment that forms the meaningful world of which we are a part.
Okay.
It is important.
He's going through that huge litany and list of things at the end. Basically, it almost feels like he's, saying there's all these different things that inform our choices, and we have to focus not on the fact that we're making choices, but we have to look at all of these things and see if they're legitimate. And that's actually really good. He lists a bunch of things that really are not quite inconsequential because they're all downstream of the false magical narrative when you're talking about a high demand religion, whether it be Scientology, Jehovah's Witnesses, or Mormonism. The things that he lists in terms of personal relationships and things like that, those things have already been shaped by these false magical narratives. And so you really have to dig down and ask yourself the question about what is actually true. Because if you want to exercise agency, you need to make sure that the information that you're acting on comports with the real world. Because if you're making decisions, and it's not even decisions, but if you're shaping an idea about who you are and what the world is, those inputs need to be actually objectively true. And you can see examples in, for example, the Heaven's Gate cult, where they thought that they were spiritual beings who could evolve beyond human. And that justified them acting out and committing mass suicide. It justified them doing genital mutilation because they felt like the inherent sexual characteristics of their body were antithetical to their true essential being. So the choices were informed by their worldview that was shaped by these false magical narratives. And to the extent that his closing statement is we need to examine those narratives to see whether or not they are actually true such that we can act on them as agents, is really good. But there tends to be there's so much stuff inputting into our decisions that, it's almost impossible to tell. And this is where we get to some of the comments that I think I've seen fly across the stream. So let's see here. Let's see. There was one comment in particular that I think is important, which is how do we know what is actually true anyway? And if you watch the recent debate between Midnight Mormons and Radio Free Mormon, there's this one moment where Kwaku is trying to really engage in a much more important discussion, I think, than the debate was framed to be, which is addressing this question. When you say something is true, what do you mean by it? Because the concept of truth has many different modes. You can have a truth that is more metaphorical or abstract. The truth of your love for your spouse, there's no, objective thing you can point to. It's a feeling that you have. Or the truth that, if in a fixed system, if supply diminishes, the price is going to go up. Like there's certain truths that are the consequences of other things that are reliable and dependable. in the realm of economics and in that example, but it's hard to describe in terms of any objective reality like scientific truth where it's subject to some form of falsifiability. And that's where these discussions like that debate get derailed, because people are talking about truth, but they may be referencing it in different modes. But this talk and the importance of this talk in terms of being able to see yourself as an agent acting as an individual is very different based on whether or not the inputs to your decisions are actually true in the objective real world sense. And what some people are tempted to do is to give up on the notion of truth and say, well, since we can't really know anything is objectively true 100%, well, then we just kind of need to just, go with it. And the question of truth doesn't really even matter. And that's a dangerous road to go down because, at some point you have to make decisions, and the decisions that you make on are based on assumptions about the nature of the decisions that you're making. And there's some inherent assumptions about truth. Otherwise, your choices mean nothing. And it's kind of like, the pursuit of truth is what you want to go for. I've talked before about how the concept of truth that I am tried to live under is something that's called provisional truth. And that's where you take all the information that you have, including confirmatory as well as disconfirmatory information, and you try to isolate those things that survive any attempts at disconfirming them, and you try to act in your best way with those inputs, but you're open to being proven wrong in the future, so that if you are basing your decisions on any false premises, you can revise them and update. And that's how the scientific method works. This scientific method does not tell you what truth is, period, end of story. The scientific method tells you what our best estimation of truth is, subject to revision with further data, further experiment, further information. And that is the thing that is, that doesn't mean that you give up. Just because you can never totally eliminate bias does not mean that there's no point in us having academic institutions that publish peer-reviewed journals. Just because some journal publishes something that eventually down the road gets disputed does not mean that you give up on the entire prospect of the pursuit of truth. So I know in a lot of these, especially because that was one of the things that postmodernism resulted in, was just a total radical nihilism about the idea that any truth can be had at all. And that is a dead end. And, if you want to talk about despair, depression taking hold of your life, if that is what shapes your worldview, then you're going to have a hard time. And that's why if you go back and look, a lot of these postmodern nihilist people committed suicide. The way that your worldview shapes your outlook is pretty powerful. Okay, so let's see. Were there any other comments for it? So let's go ahead, and we have a few minutes left. Let's just see if we want to take any calls. So if we can put the call banner up, I'll let my producer do that. I will go ahead and open up the phone lines if you would like to share a little bit of your perspective on this question of agency and the importance of truth. I don't think he was intending for it to be this way, but this presenter at the Fair Mormon Conference did a really good job of showing why it is so important that you challenge and question the narratives that you're being given about who you are and the world around you, and the assumptions that we have that feed into our decisions. Because if those assumptions, if those narratives are magical and not based in objective reality, then your agency is diminished. Your ability to act as an individual and your identity as an individual are diminished and obviated by these false magical narratives. So it's really important stuff. Okay, so while we're waiting for a call, let's just see if we have a... Okay, so somebody mentions, I like Jonathan Haidt's conversation with Sam Harris on this. He says, basically, we as individuals are terrible at discovering truth because of our various biases. But as many ideas hit each other, you are left with something closer to truth. I think this idea, there's a book by Jonathan Rauch called The Constitution of Knowledge. And in it, he makes the case that knowledge is really not formulated by one person expressing their ideas, even if they're really well thought out ideas. Knowledge is established by different perspectives challenging those ideas, and the ideas that survive the challenges become our refined understanding of truth, because it's the challenge to these ideas if it survives it, that establishes the truth of it. And that's just another way to formulate Karl Popper's principle of falsifiability as the key distinguishing feature, which separates some of the softer forms of science. He was looking at Einstein versus Sigmund Freud and the differences in the way that they were making predictions or explaining the world around them. Freud was retrospectively shaping his ideology to the situations, and he could always come up with an answer, whereas Einstein was looking at the world, creating predictions based on objective understanding of the world. And then if the predictions turned out to be false, then his understanding is wrong and it has to be revised. And there's a very significant fundamental difference there. Okay, so the phone number is 210-422-2222 if you want to share any of your thoughts on this topic. I think it was interesting. If we look at the comments on the video itself, somebody said, I love how he used the idea of Smith believing in a monster under the bed, since it's the same level of nonsense. Okay, now this, I doubt that's... Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff.
No way. Hey, I'm from San Antonio, and I can't believe I caught you live. You're so smart.
Well, what's on your mind today?
What I'm reacting to this is I don't think there is an objective truth. I don't think that we can attain that in this world. I think the only way that we know anything, the only thing that is a fact, is what literally our senses can perceive. And that's why Kwaku and RFM were sitting there thinking, but what is a fact? What is truth? They're really, it's an abstract that our brains just sort of gaze at, but we can't really form in thoughts that communicate. That's what I think. That's what my experience has confirmed to me. What do you think?
Well, I think that for me, I agree. There's no absolute truth that you should say the book is now closed and we no longer challenge it, we no longer question it, we no longer try to understand any more about that, because that assumption blinds you to any further knowledge about what is actually going on. I don't think that means then that we need to abandon the pursuit of truth. I don't think that means that you simply, because several people have said, as soon as you let go of the idea that we can pursue an understanding of the world around us, that we can challenge ideas and allow that pursuit of truth to take shape, if you abandon that, then what you have are just different people's ideas and opinions all flurrying around. And essentially, it'll come down to who has the most power, who can make their perspective and their ideas become dominant by means of force.
I think that's true in an authoritarian system, but I was really surprised that there are other systems than the authoritarian system. I was fortunate enough to meet Paula Underwood, who was the inheritor of this vast oral history from her people who ended up in the Northeast, the Great Lakes area. She was, I think, Oneida. And basically the whole history is a history of how the people learned to have the wisdom of ordered counsel, so that the people would all explain what they saw, what they thought, and everybody got to speak, no matter how old, no matter how young, and then they would make their decision. So what that led to was a community that was living in some sort of a subjective group truth that they could all live with. And then if somebody said, hey man, I would rather eat peyote and have a different way, then they formed their own community, or they went off, and did their thing. So it was a liquid formulation. And that, to me, that's much closer to living in a world of shared facts than this tendency that we have inherited from this Catholic system of we're the right ones, we're on top, so you will listen to us. And I really agree what you're saying, that these authoritarian figures are saying, you need to know all this stuff so you can have a free choice. And at some point, I feel like we look inside and we go, what is inside is more valuable to me, and there's more truth there. And so I think that our ability to find truth is completely subjective, and yet when you get there, it's universal. What do you think of that?
No, I think the idea that people are free to come up with their own conception of truth is really powerful. And for me, having a society where people are free to express differences of opinion about the way that they see the world is really important, because it's really when you challenge opinions with other opinions, when you challenge one person's bias with somebody else's bias, is where you can sift through the things. Now, in the situation that you describe, where if somebody says, no, I don't accept the communal truth that this group has, so I'm going to go off and start my own group, and they have the freedom to do that without force or coercion, that's great. The thing that people bring up when you talk about this is that there is a final arbiter of this collective truth, and that is reality. And so that is one of these groups is going to have an understanding that is closer to reality, that understands reality better, and so is able to take advantage of the consequences of that understanding. Now, you could say, for example, this group has different ideas.
Can I just say that that is the definition of the authoritarian system, and it is flawed, because there is no way in a world of perception to get to a fact that applies to everyone.
Okay, so that's a brilliant starting point. So there is this concept called Lysenkoism that happened in Russia. And so we have an understanding of how genetics works and how agriculture works that's based on people collecting ideas, and this evolves over time, and our understanding is at first imperfect and it gradually improves. And so if you take the idea that all of these perspectives are the same and people are free to do that, and that reality represents an authoritarian oppressive force that we want to escape from or not be subject to, that's a good idea, but it has implications, because the people who followed the kind of Darwinian understanding of evolution and the implications for that in our understanding of agriculture shaped their agricultural principles along one set of lines. And people who held on to different sets of ideas and tried to conform their agricultural approach to a political notion of the world. In Russia, this is the Lysenkoism thing. They said, well, if we bury our seeds deeper, then what is going to happen is they're going to be more acclimated. And if we freeze our seeds for a period of time, then they're going to be more acclimated to our area in Russia. And so we'll get better crops in this way. So there were different ways of thinking about this agricultural question. One of them was closer to their understanding of reality. And so you get better crops, you better yield, you can sustain your society more. And the other one, because their ideas did not comport with reality, it resulted in famine. So there, as much as you want to say the real world doesn't, that's an authoritarian thing, it is the real world that's last. If your ideas are out of touch with the real world, then to the extent that your understanding has consequences that are rooted in reality, there are going to be consequences.
You have a really long flow of thought there. I want to back up to the real world is a different thing than what we're talking about. We're talking about the world of ideas, abstract ideas. What is truth? What is agency? I don't think any of us thinks alone. None of us comes to, everybody's objective reality. We only each have a small part of that knowledge. And that's how, like in Russia, they shared the idea of the frozen seeds. There's that is a wonderful flow of thought. I found this absolutely amazing story in Paula Underwood. She actually wrote this book from this story. She learned it in Oneida language and then translated it to English. The Institute of Noetic Sciences, who I imagine you would love to learn about if you don't already know, paid for her to publish this book. I mean, it is connected with people who think. The story is it's called Growing Woman. It's a long story. I have it on my podcast called The Walking People by Miriam Moore. Yes, I am Miriam Moore. And you might love listening to it, because the basis for that is that there was a a woman, it was hunter-gatherer times. Everyone walked for their food and drank the water that rained. And she became arthritic, and she could no longer get around. And so, she wouldn't let anyone feed her. And her daughter said, "You fed me, let me feed you." And she said, I won't. If I can't feed myself, I'm going to learn the consequences. And everyone was looking at her like, "Hey, lady, you've been very generous to us all, so let us help you now." And they would just leave food around for her. But her daughter thought, "No, hang on. She's an independent lady. She wants to continue." I mean, it's a story that teaches how the people changed their thinking, because she brought some seeds and she put them near where they lived, and they grew. And then she started telling her friends about it, and they went, "Huh, what?" They didn't understand. So she said, "How am I going to share this thinking?" And so she showed them how to do it, and they still didn't get it. And then the next year, the seeds sprouted, and they started to realize what was possible. But then everybody else in the tribe, they thought, how are we going to share this with everyone else? And so the old lady, they called her Bending Woman, the mother, sat by the plant, and she told everybody in the tribe, "My daughter has planted these. I want to see if they'll grow here. Please respect them." But there were some people that were so afraid of the idea that they came to destroy the seeds. And this is the funny part. It was then they learned just how fierce an old and bending woman with a heavy staff can be. And at last, everybody allowed these 3 seeds to grow to learn what may happen. And
so you're expressing a line of thought that we're seeing more commonly now, which is a deep reverence for indigenous ways of knowing, and a desire to return to a mode of thought that is expressed in these narrative stories that are from indigenous peoples. Exactly, experiential peoples. Right. And so the question, when you ask the question of what is truth, how can we know is true, then you have to ask yourself the question of, do we accept these stories and the implications of them from indigenous peoples as objectively true in the real world because they come from indigenous people?
No.
Or are we able to test them? And what is your perspective on that? Do you take stories from indigenous people and say, well, just because they come from this collection of stories, we have to accept them in the real world, or how do you interact with them?
Thank you. The idea of the stories, all of them, is that they're learning stories. And they're stories about how these people who were confused and didn't know, didn't have solutions to their problems, learned from one another through experience. And the way
are there different ways of learning that are more productive than others, in that they get you closer to real truth than others?
I think that the only way for us to achieve that is through everyone to have a voice, because everyone does have a different way of learning. Everyone does learn different things than other people. And so if we can form a community where we're actually speaking to each other, listening to each other, that is, people as a group is the wisdom of the people. Nobody, who is the scientist? There's some science recently presented that our brains individually hold very little information, but our superpowers.
So in the question of the wisdom of the people, if you've got a society of, 1 million people and you've got 1 million different ideas, how do you sort through and find which ideas, for example, will yield better crops, since the society is dependent on that? And so if you then if you don't try to sift through and say, well, some ideas are better than others, and the way you establish which ideas are better than others is by testing them, seeing which ones come out with a better yield, then you come to a closer understanding of society. And this is why when you look at the landscape of history, you can see certain cultures that did not adapt new ways of knowing. As soon as the plow was invented, and then that shaped how they were able to till fields. But then those tools were never refined and built upon. And so generation after generation, father, son, parent, child, they're using the same tool sets and they're not advancing. And then as soon as the scientific method comes in and says, this is a way that we can actually advance the process of understanding the world and learning new things and doing better to interact with reality in ways that give us what we need as a society, the resources that we need, well, then suddenly you have an explosion of advancement in technology that gives people more yields that can support bigger populations. So there's different ways of transmitting and challenging knowledge that some work better than others. And it has to do with,
the scientific method goes to the real world and says what is observable. That is what it's anchored in. The scientific method is the world of observable reality. It steps away from these universal yada yadas. It's very local. It's very perceivable. It can be disproven.
What is? I think
society.
When you say it can be disproven, you mean the objective world.
No,
the
theory that the scientific method is figuring out, like the function of clouds. In fact,
no, I think that's important. Is that you're right. It does need to be disprovable, meaning that you allow someone to challenge it. You allow someone to question it. If we have an idea, for example, about the law of gravity and what governs the physical material in our world, and you have the Newtonian physics model where we have these algebraic equations that allow us to predict things, and then you say we can never question it. Then when somebody else comes in and says, well, I have a different understanding that accounts for when those rules break down and they don't seem to apply, and this new understanding accounts for everything that we understood before and more, then it actually gives us more ability, like the ability that I have to communicate with you over the internet, that you can call me, is based on the implications of that we allowed people to question these theories, prove them wrong or prove them incomplete and inadequate, and come to a greater understanding. So I think you're drawing on this, it's kind of like different ways in our pursuit of understanding of the world. You don't want to lose importance of the side of our humanity, the side of the stories and the lives of people that exist. You don't want to allow the pursuit of science and technology to rob us of our humanity. And so I think it's always important that we're doing the things that you're mentioning, where you're looking at the stories of people at the local level, seeing how technology impacts their lives, and that we as a society ask our question about, is the science and technology that we're pursuing actually good for us? Is it where we want our society to move? And that's an important thing.
Yeah, that is one of the questions. What I'm actually saying is that I think that you and I are coming to an agreement, and I think that that's the value of discussion, and when a person thinks about things and observes things and has somebody else intelligent to talk to about. The thing that I've learned about these stories is that they're not so much like saying, hey, we're valuable just because we're indigenous. They're saying, hey, we're valuable because we can show how we learn to survive in a new land. And their vast history, every story is about how they learned from each other and how they synthesized their knowledge to leap forward. And I've been fascinated because I love archaeology, anthropology, and some of the scientific questions are, how did we survive the ice age? How did we learn to wear clothes? How did we go from being hairless apes
to where we are now? Well, it's a very fascinating question. I want to see if I can get one more call in. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective.
Thank you so much for taking my call. Thank you.
All right, take care.
Ciao.
All right, bye now. Okay, so I think that we're seeing more and more people kind of looking at the world and the chaos and the confusion with all these different perspectives, all this, if you can't have any objective reality, then no reality really matters, and nobody's unbiased, so everyone's biased. And it's kind of like it's the truth crisis that we as a society are facing, when you can't rely on journalists, for example, to try to convey impartial truth. At least, even if you understand nobody's impartial, nobody's unbiased, just the fact that pursuit is completely abandoned, where people are just embracing their bias outright, then that's kind of a problem for the institutions that we rely on to try to make sense of the world. And you can say that, that journalism is going down that road is one form of danger. But if academia itself, if our very institutions of research and understanding are also going down that road, then we're going to basically just face where our trajectory of progress and advancement is going to diminish and it's going to flatline. And we're just not going to make the advancements until some of those ideas work themselves out. So anyway, okay, well, with that being said, I have to go and live in the real world for a little bit more. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. And we will go ahead and close it out. I hope to have more about the Cultural Revolution. I know some people are probably rolling their eyes and be like, why is he talking about the Cultural Revolution? But it's just a really fascinating period of history that I think we have a lot to learn from. And there's stories that aren't really being told in the Western world because a lot of the stuff is only in Chinese language that you can find that I've been able to dig some stuff out about. And so we'll have some interesting stuff in the future. So until next time, this has been Talk on Things and Stuff. Bye now.